For centuries, the origin of Ethiopia's Jewish community remained one of the most fiercely debated mysteries in African and Jewish history. Religious leaders argued over it. Historians searched ancient texts for evidence. Ethiopian kings traced their authority to the same biblical legend. And the Beta Israel themselves repeated a story their ancestors had carried for generations, that they descended from Israelites who reached Ethiopia during the age of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Some said they were the lost tribe of Dan. Others believed their ancestors were Israelite priests who traveled south with Menelik, the legendary son of Solomon. A completely different theory claimed they were indigenous Ethiopians who adopted Judaism centuries later after contact with Jewish communities across the Red Sea. For hundreds of years, both sides had stories, traditions, and fragments of history, but neither side possessed evidence strong enough to end the argument. Then geneticists opened the Beta Israel genome. What they found appeared to destroy the ancient migration story completely. Ethiopian Jews did not genetically cluster with Ashkenazi, Sephardi, or Middle Eastern Jewish populations. Their DNA placed them overwhelmingly beside their Ethiopian neighbors, particularly the Amhara and Tigrayan peoples. The maternal line told the same story. Instead of revealing an isolated Israelite population preserved for nearly 3,000 years, the genome pointed toward deep indigenous Ethiopian ancestry. For generations, neither side could prove its case. Legends were not migration records. Religious practices were remarkable, but beliefs can move without large populations moving with them. Written sources appeared too late, contradicted one another, or described the community only after it was established. By the time Operation Solomon began, the decision to recognize and rescue the Beta Israel rested on religious judgment, historical interpretation, and moral urgency, not a genetic answer. More than 14,000 people were carried out of danger before science could say whether the bloodline described in their oldest traditions had existed. Then geneticists examined the genome, and the result appeared devastatingly clear. Ethiopian Jews did not cluster with Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or Mizrahi Jewish populations. They clustered with other Ethiopians, especially highland communities who had lived beside them for centuries. Their maternal DNA pointed overwhelmingly toward indigenous African ancestry. The most direct reading was that Beta Israel identity had emerged primarily through local conversion, not through a large migration of ancient Israelites. It seemed DNA had separated history from legend. But the story did not end there. When scientists widened the investigation beyond the Beta Israel and studied Ethiopia itself, they discovered a second signal buried across the genomes of many Ethiopian peoples, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim alike. Roughly 3,000 years ago, ancestry connected to populations of the Levant entered the Ethiopian highlands in a major admixture event. The timing fell close to the era associated with the Solomon and Sheba tradition. The DNA did not confirm the legend in the form people repeated it, yet it refused to dismiss it completely. It suggested that two histories had become fused into one, an ancient connection between Ethiopia and the Near East, followed centuries later by the rise of a distinct Jewish community whose identity may have been preserved rather than inherited through an unbroken Israelite bloodline. That is the mystery at the center of this story. DNA appeared to disprove the Beta Israel's most famous origin claim, then uncovered evidence that something similar to Ethiopia's oldest legend had genuinely happened. The rescue had already taken place. The community had already been recognized. Only afterward did science reveal that the truth was neither the miracle believers expected nor the complete invention skeptics assumed, but a far more complicated history hidden across an entire nation's genome. In 2010, a research team led by Doron Bahar published a comprehensive genome-wide study of Jewish population genetics in the journal Nature. incorporating genetic samples from Ethiopian Jews alongside more than a dozen other global Jewish communities, comparing them systematically against non-Jewish reference populations from every region where Jewish communities historically settled. A year earlier, in 2009, a separate and highly influential study led by Sarah Tishkoff examining genetic diversity across the African continent more broadly and published as part of one of the largest African population genetics projects ever undertaken, incorporated detailed autosomal DNA analysis of the Beta Israel as part of a sweeping investigation into African population structure, drawing on comparative data from populations across the entire continent to place Ethiopian Jewish ancestry within its proper genetic context. These two studies, conducted independently, using different sample sets and somewhat different methodologies, converged on the same core finding regarding where Beta Israel ancestry actually sits within the broader landscape of Ethiopian and Jewish population genetics. That convergence mattered enormously because it meant the finding wasn't a quirk of one particular data set or one particular research team's assumptions, but a result that held up across independently gathered evidence, collected by different laboratories working with different research goals in mind. A separate and in some ways even more significant piece of research arrived in 2012, when a team led by Luca Pagani at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute and the University of Cambridge published a detailed genome-wide study in the American Journal of Human Genetics, examining not the Beta Israel specifically, but the genetic structure of the broader Ethiopian population as a whole, across multiple ethnic and linguistic groups, including the Amhara, Oromo, and several smaller populations. This study wasn't designed to investigate Jewish ancestry at all. It was designed to understand Ethiopian population history in general, and specifically to trace patterns of admixture between African and non-African ancestral sources across the country's various ethnic and linguistic communities. But in the process, it uncovered a finding that would end up mattering enormously to the specific question of Beta Israel origins, and to the older legend that Ethiopian Jewish identity had always been tied to. To understand why these findings landed with such force, you first need to understand the depth and specificity of the story they were being tested against. The Beta Israel, a name meaning House of Israel, in the Ge'ez language of ancient Ethiopia, and the community's own preferred term over the historically pejorative label Falasha, meaning outsider or exile, trace their own origin back to one of the most famous stories in the Hebrew Bible. According to the first book of Kings, the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem to witness the wisdom and wealth of King Solomon. And according to Ethiopian tradition recorded in a foundational 14th century text called the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, their meeting produced a son, Menelik, who later traveled to Jerusalem as a young man, met his father, and returned to Ethiopia accompanied by a retinue of Israelite nobles and priests, founding the Solomonic dynasty that would rule Ethiopia in an unbroken line for close to 3,000 years, ending only with the deposition of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. The Kebra Nagast itself became one of the most culturally significant texts in Ethiopian history, so deeply woven into national identity that it shaped royal legitimacy, religious architecture, modeled explicitly on descriptions of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and the self-understanding of an entire nation for well over half a millennium. Within this broader legend, the Beta Israel's own tradition tells a distinct and more specific story. Rather than claiming descent from Menelik himself as Ethiopia's Christian ruling dynasty and the broader Ethiopian Orthodox Church did, the Beta Israel maintained that their own ancestors were the Israelite nobles and priests who accompanied Menelik back from Jerusalem, or, in an alternative telling favored by some scholars and community members, descendants of the lost tribe of Dan, one of the 10 northern tribes of the ancient kingdom of Israel that were dispersed following the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE. Reinforcing the antiquity of this claim, some observers pointed to the Beta Israel's religious practice itself. Their tradition preserved forms of Judaism reflecting only the Hebrew Bible and older Jewish law, entirely lacking familiarity with the Talmud and other rabbinic writings compiled centuries after the biblical period, which some argued was evidence that the community had separated from the mainstream Jewish world at an extremely early date, before those later religious texts had even been written, having developed its own distinct religious calendar, priesthood, and monastic tradition entirely independent of developments taking place within the wider Jewish world during the same centuries. A rival, considerably less romantic theory emerged from a different reading of the same historical record. According to this account, sometimes called the conversion hypothesis and now dominant among most population geneticists and many historians working in the field, the Beta Israel were not descendants of ancient Israelite migrants at all, but rather local Ethiopian highlanders, most likely from Semitic-speaking Agau or related populations, who adopted a form of Judaism sometime during late antiquity or the early medieval period, likely influenced by Jewish communities and Jewish religious ideas that had already reached the region through trade contact across the narrow Strait of the Red Sea with South Arabia, particularly the Jewish kingdom of Himyar, in what is now Yemen, which flourished for several centuries, converted its own ruling class to Judaism, and maintained active trade and cultural exchange with the Ethiopian highlands directly across the water before its final conquest by Christian Aksumite forces. Under this theory, the community's own belief in ancient Israelite descent and its retention of only the earlier layers of Jewish scripture and law reflected the circumstances of a relatively isolated local conversion process, absorbing an early and incomplete form of Jewish religious practice before losing regular contact with the wider Jewish world for many subsequent centuries, rather than genuine unbroken biological descent from the ancient Near East. Historical evidence existed to support pieces of both accounts without conclusively settling the matter either way. In the 6th century CE, the Christian king of the Ethiopian Empire of Aksum, Caleb, launched a military campaign across the Red Sea into South Arabia, specifically to depose a Jewish king who had been persecuting Christians in the region, an episode that confirms real, documented, centuries-old contact between the Ethiopian highlands and Jewish populations across the Red Sea, though it does not by itself prove exactly how or when that contact translated into an established Jewish community within Ethiopia itself. Other historical sources place the emergence of the Beta Israel as a clearly defined, distinct ethno-religious group sometime between the 14th and 16th centuries CE, considerably later than the community's own legendary 10th century BCE origin story would suggest, though this later date could equally describe when an already ancient community became more clearly documented in surviving written records, rather than when the community itself first came into existence. For centuries, this dispute could not be resolved through historical or textual evidence alone, because both accounts drew on genuinely ambiguous, incomplete evidence that supporters on each side interpreted according to their preferred conclusion. Only a direct examination of the Beta Israel genome compared systematically against both other global Jewish populations and neighboring Ethiopian populations could actually test which historical scenario the biological evidence supported. The genetic evidence, once assembled across multiple independent studies, delivered an unusually clear and consistent verdict, one of the least ambiguous findings in the entire field of Jewish population genetics. The 2010 Behar study found that among every Jewish population examined in the entire research project, Ethiopian Jews showed the highest degree of genetic differentiation from every other Jewish community sampled, standing entirely apart from the clusters formed by Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jewish populations, which, despite their own considerable internal diversity, at least shared a recognizable core genetic signal, connecting them back toward the ancient Levant. Ethiopian Jews did not fall within that broader signal at all. Rather than clustering with any other branch of the global Jewish diaspora or with Middle Eastern populations more generally, the genome-wide data placed Ethiopian Jews unambiguously alongside their non-Jewish Ethiopian neighbors. The 2009 Tishkoff study, examining African genetic diversity on a continental scale, reinforced this same conclusion with even greater geographic and ethnic specificity. Ethiopian Jews were found to belong predominantly to the same broad genetic cluster as other Cushitic-speaking and Ethio-Semitic-speaking populations of the Horn of Africa, showing their closest genetic affinities specifically to the Amhara and Tigrayan peoples, the same two ethnic groups that form the core of Ethiopia's historically Christian population, and the same two groups whose own oral traditions also claim descent from the Solomon and Sheba legend through the separate lineage of Menelik and the Ethiopian royal line. In other words, Ethiopian Jews were not simply similar to some generic African population. They were genetically almost indistinguishable from the very same Ethiopian ethnic communities whose competing version of the same ancient legend describes a different non-Jewish line of descent from the identical biblical story. Mitochondrial DNA analysis added further, granular detail to this picture. Research examining Beta Israel maternal lineages found that just over half, approximately 51%, belonged to macrohaplogroup L, a lineage group overwhelmingly associated with sub-Saharan African ancestry, and found it only trace frequencies, if at all, in Jewish populations elsewhere in the world. This maternal signature stood in sharp contrast to Ashkenazi mitochondrial DNA, which, as separate research has shown, traces predominantly to prehistoric European lineages and to Mizrahi and Sephardic mitochondrial patterns, which show far closer connections to Levantine and broader Middle Eastern maternal ancestry. If the Beta Israel truly represented an unbroken maternal line stretching back to ancient Israelite women who accompanied Menelik's retinue nearly 3,000 years ago, the mitochondrial evidence should have shown at least some meaningful trace of that ancient Near Eastern maternal signal. Instead, the maternal line pointed overwhelmingly toward indigenous African ancestry, matching the same broader pattern the autosomal genome-wide data had already established. Taken together, this body of genetic evidence pointed toward a specific and, for many observers, surprising conclusion. Rather than representing a genuinely separate population that migrated from the ancient Near East and remained isolated within Ethiopia for millennia, the Beta Israel appear at the level of the genome to be fundamentally an indigenous Ethiopian population, most likely emerging through a historical process of religious conversion among local Semitic-speaking highland communities. Adopting Jewish religious law and practice, quite possibly influenced by real historical contact with Jewish communities across the Red Sea in South Arabia, but without the large-scale genetic contribution from actual Israelite or broader Levantine migrants that the community's own Solomon and Sheba origin legend describes. Some researchers, including author John Entine, in his widely read book examining Jewish genetic history, have pushed back against reading the genetic evidence quite this decisively, arguing that a small, ancient founding contribution from genuine Israelite migrants could have been absorbed and effectively diluted into the surrounding Ethiopian population over nearly 3 millennia of subsequent local intermarriage, making it statistically difficult for modern genetic methods to detect a signal that thin at this historical distance. This remains a genuine minority position within the field, and while the overwhelming weight of published genetic evidence favors the conversion hypothesis, describing the question as absolutely beyond any scholarly disagreement would slightly overstate the current state of the academic debate. It's worth pausing on how significant and in some ways how emotionally complicated this finding actually is. The genetic evidence does not suggest that Beta Israel identity is somehow fraudulent or recent. Religious conversion of an entire community, sustained across many centuries through strict religious law, careful maintenance of purity customs, and deliberate cultural transmission from one generation to the next, is every bit as real and as historically significant a form of Jewish identity as descent by direct biological lineage. Numerous other Jewish communities around the world, including significant populations within the Mizrahi and Sephardic worlds, incorporate real, documented historical conversion somewhere in their ancestral story. What the genetic evidence does clarify, with unusual precision for this field, is that the specific version of the Beta Israel origin story, built around direct biological descent from ancient Israelite migrants who accompanied Menelik, is not well supported by the DNA, even though the deeper connection to Jewish religious identity and law that the community has preserved for many centuries is entirely real and unquestioned. This is where the story would ordinarily end, a relatively clean resolution in favor of the conversion hypothesis, consistent with the pattern seen in several other diaspora Jewish communities whose genetic ancestry turned out to reflect more local admixture than their own oldest legends proposed. But the 2012 Pagani study, examining not Beta Israel specifically but the broader Ethiopian population as a whole, uncovered something that added a genuinely unexpected layer to the entire legend, one that neither side of the original Beta Israel debate had anticipated. Analyzing genome-wide data across multiple Ethiopian ethnic and linguistic groups, the Pagani team identified clear evidence of a substantial ancient admixture event, in which the ancestors of many Ethiopian populations mixed with a non-African Eurasian source population. Using a statistical technique that estimates the timing of historical admixture events by analyzing how genetic segments inherited from each ancestral source break down and shorten over successive generations, the researchers dated this mixing event to approximately 3,000 years ago, a period well before the historically documented Islamic expansions of the 7th century CE, and well before the European colonial era, placing the admixture squarely within the same general time frame traditionally associated with the biblical era of Solomon and Sheba. Critically, when the researchers examined exactly which modern populations this ancient non-African genetic component most closely resembled, the answer pointed not to nearby Yemen, directly across the narrow Red Sea Strait, as a purely geographic explanation might predict, but specifically to populations in Egypt, Israel, and Syria, the heart of the ancient Levant. Chris Tyler Smith of the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, one of the researchers involved in this line of work, noted in comments following the study's publication that the genetic evidence pointed toward gene flow into Ethiopia from the Levant occurring roughly 3,000 years ago, and that this specific finding fit remarkably well with the traditional legend of the Queen of Sheba. It's important to be precise about exactly what this finding does and does not establish. This particular genetic signal describes an ancient admixture event affecting the broader Ethiopian population as a whole, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations alike, across multiple ethnic groups including the Amhara, the Oromo, and others, rather than something unique or specific to the Beta Israel community by itself. It does not, on its own, revive the specific claim that the Beta Israel descend from a distinct wave of Israelite migrants separate from their Christian and Muslim Ethiopian neighbors. If anything, this finding reinforces the broader genetic picture already established, that Ethiopian Jews and Ethiopian Christians, despite their very different religious traditions and their very different competing legends about Solomon and Sheba, are drawing that shared ancient story from what appears to be, at the genetic level, essentially the same underlying ancestral population and the same ancient contact event with the Near East. Later research, including a genome-wide study of Egyptian and Ethiopian populations published in 2015, refined this picture further, confirming that most Ethiopian ethnic groups carry a substantial proportion of non-African ancestry, with the Amhara and Oromo populations specifically showing roughly half of their genome derived from this Eurasian source, and dating the midpoint of these regional admixture events to somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 years ago, closely matching the earlier Pagani findings and lending further confidence to the overall timeline. This body of research collectively suggests a more complex and, in its own way, more interesting historical reality than either the pure migration legend or the pure local conversion theory captured on its own. A genuine ancient contact event connecting the Ethiopian highlands to the Near East roughly 3,000 years ago, echoing in a real biological signal, the very story the Solomon and Sheba legend has preserved in oral and written tradition for millennia, layered underneath a later and more specific religious history in which the Beta Israel emerged as a distinct community through conversion, likely encouraged by additional centuries of documented Jewish contact across the Red Sea with South Arabia, including the well-documented 6th century episode involving King Caleb's military campaign against the Jewish kingdom of Himyar. For centuries, the story of the Beta Israel's origins was told as a single, dramatic narrative of ancient migration, Israelite nobles crossing from Jerusalem to the Ethiopian highlands alongside the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, carrying their faith intact across nearly 3,000 years of isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. Genetics didn't simply confirm or deny that story. It separated it into two distinct threads that had been woven together in oral tradition for centuries. A genuine, ancient, 3,000-year-old genetic contact between the Ethiopian highlands and the ancient Near East, real and measurable in the DNA of Ethiopians broadly, Jewish and Christian alike, echoing across an entire nation the same ancient encounter their shared legend has always pointed toward, and a separate, more specific religious history in which a distinct highland community adopted Jewish law and identity, sustained it with remarkable devotion across many centuries of relative isolation from the wider Jewish world, and carried that devotion all the way to a covert airlift in 1991 that brought over 14,000 of them home in a single 36-hour operation. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the genetic evidence, in this case, didn't simply hand a clean victory to either side of a centuries-old argument. It offered something more precise and, in its own way, more moving. Proof that the ancient contact underlying the Solomon and Sheba legend is real, written into the shared genome of an entire nation, while the specifically Jewish thread of that story reflects something different and, if anything, more remarkable. Not inherited passively through unbroken bloodline, but actively chosen, preserved, and defended by a community across centuries of geographic isolation from every other Jewish community on earth, right up until the moment more than 100,000 of them were finally reunited with the wider Jewish world their ancestors had never actually needed blood ties to belong to in the first place. It's worth remembering, too, that this same conclusion carries real weight beyond the academic question of ancestry. It was the 1975 rabbinical ruling recognizing the Beta Israel's Jewish identity, made decades before any of this genetic evidence existed, that made the entire rescue possible in the first place, a reminder that questions of belonging are not always, and perhaps should not always be, settled by genetics alone. If a legend this old, this specific, and this widely told across an entire nation's religious traditions could reveal both a genuine ancient truth and a more complicated modern history, once geneticists finally examined it directly, it raises a question worth sitting with. How many other communities, holding on to origin stories passed down across dozens of generations, are still waiting for their own DNA to reveal which parts of their legend are historical memory, and which parts were built later on top of something that turns out to be even more interesting than the myth itself. If this investigation changed how you see the relationship between ancestry, faith, and identity, subscribe to DNA Origins for more evidence-led documentaries about the genetic history hidden inside the world's peoples. And tell us in the comments when DNA and oral tradition disagree which should carry more weight, the laboratory result, the community's memory, or both together.